Section 7 of the Soul, or Rational Psychology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Soul, or Rational Psychology, by Emanuel Swedenborg. Translated by Frank Sewall, 1837 to 1915, and others. Section 7. 2. The Senses. 15. The external organs of the senses, as the ear and the eye, are instruments of the modifications of the air and of the ether, and these modifications are the principal causes to which as to mediate organs the sensations exactly correspond. As to the ear, this is the instrument which receives the modulations of the air, for it receives and applies to itself every form and mode of the forces flowing to it. The same is true of the eye in relation to the ether. The ear in this respect differs from a musical or acoustical instrument in that it not only receives but also sends out and further extends the sounds. So does also the eye differ from optical instruments. The eye is indeed like the camera obscura, which reproduces most exactly the images transmitted from the object opposed, without changing them into other forms and other colors. But in the eye these modifications do not simply pass over to the retina. The operations of the eye excite the essential determinations to acting likewise even to the least retina, from which through the optic nerve the same sight is propagated to the common sensory. Thus the sensations correspond exactly to the modifications of the organs, likewise in taste and smell. From the external form of the parts, which is generally either round or prickly, affects the papillae of the tongue or nostrils. The organ is affected by these touches, which are innumerable, and thence a similar sense results. 16. The sensory fibres leading to the common sensory are exactly accommodated to the form of the modifications flowing in and affecting them. Thus the sensations flow by a natural spontaneity from the circumfluent world through the fibres in the animated world even to the soul. In the inquiry as to what is the form of the modifications of the air and of the ether, we are led to conclude from experience that there can be no other modification of form than that of the form of the parts. For the volume is composed of the parts, and if the parts are changeable, a like condition ought to result in the whole volumen of what is set in motion, as in the single parts, which are so many symbols of the common motion. The form of the modifications of the ether is spiral, or perpetually circular, and that of the modifications of the air is simply circular, for such are the external forms of the parts, as may be demonstrated by numberless proofs. It may be asked then, what is the form of the fluxations of the fibres? It has been proved in the treatise on the fibres that the form of the fluxions of each compound fibre is spiral, and that the form of the fluxions of many fibres, taken together, is circular. Thus the one form exactly corresponds to the modifications of the ether, and the other to the modifications of the air. But the form of the higher ether is vortical, and this corresponds to the substantial form of the spiral glandule. Thus when modifications of the auras flow into the miniature world, or the animal system, they continue their flow in a similar nature, nor are their essential determinations changed. 17. The sensations are carried from the external organs to the internal organs, as if from a heavy to a lighter atmosphere, or from a lower to a higher region. Light bodies are raised from the centre toward the surface and emerge, but those which are heavy fall to the centre and seek the bottom. So do sensations strive from the outermost to the innermost, or from the lowest to the highest, while actions fall from the innermost to the outermost, or from the highest to the lowest. Thus sensations may be compared to the lighter and actions to the heavier bodies. The cortical brain holds the inmost and the highest, for to climb thither is upward, but thence toward the surface of the body is downward. That the cortex of the brain also occupies the highest region of the body may appear from the fibres themselves and their nature. The most fluid and the softest fibres are near to the cortex, or to their first source. Those more remote from the cortex are harder and more stationary, and as if being more compressed, when rising to a softer fibre, they rise to the pure region, and vice versa. Which also is the reason why the nerves or the sensory fibres are soft, and the motor fibres are somewhat harder, and that the softness increases according to the ascent. 18. The sensations do not arrive at any special glandules or glandular congeries in the brain, but at the universal cortex, so that there is not a single cortical glandule in the entire brain which does not become a participant of each sense, and of its least movement, degree, and difference. This the anatomy of the brain declares with sufficient distinctness, for each nerve and each fibre, when it is immerged in the medullary lake of the brain, so merges itself with all the neighbouring ones that all differences well nigh disappear. For one fold is continually connected with another, a certain subtle membrane intervening between every fibre and every vessel and the one next to it, which membrane joins and binds fibre to fibre and artery to artery. Those intervening threads, in their being drawn out from the fibre, we call the emulous vessels of the fibre. In these are inserted the most delicate threads drawn from the pia mater. Thus it may clearly be seen that in the brain, in the cerebellum, and in either medulla, there is nothing whatever that is discontinuous or disjoined. And the sensation, which is a most subtle kind of trembling of a certain atmosphere, is not able to press solely upon a single fibre, or any particular fibres, as far as to their origins, but is compelled also to pursue its journey through all that is continuous from the fibre. And this is true as well of the trembling and vibrations of harder bodies. The same appears from the special investigation of each sensory fibre. For the optic nerve, diffusing itself in the beds of the optic nerves, cannot help pouring itself upon the entire circuit of the brain, since the fibres drawn forth from this circuit and concentrated on a firmer base unite upon the beds of the optic nerves. And if the sensations follow the flux of these, they cannot but terminate in the common surface of the brain. The olfactory nerves, from the continued pituitary membrane, so immerse themselves in the oval centre or medullar globe of the brain, that they have their origins from all, for the mammillary processes being inflated expand the whole medulla of the brain. The acoustic or auditory nerves, emerging from the annular protuberance, associate themselves with all the fibres which are sent out from the brain and from the cerebellum. And so in other instances, wherefore the ratio of the sensations is the same as that of the modifications, for these, having begun in the least centre, diffuse themselves about into the entire periphery. From these considerations it follows that there is no part of the cortex which does not become participant and conscious of the inflowing sensation. 19. The most distinct sensation exists in the cortex of the brain, especially the sensation of sight, perception, and understanding. Where the cortical substances are most delicate and most expanded, there the sensations should be the more perfect and distinct. For that the cerebrum feels, perceives, and understands, but not the cerebellum, is because the cortical glandules, like so many little sensories, are in a state of perceiving modes distinctly, in either protuberance or vertex of the brain, that is, in its supreme lobe. This cortex is distinctly divided, For an infinite number of fissures and furrows separate the congeries, by which means the cortex may be expanded and drawn in any direction, so that when the distinction is the more perfect, there is also the more perfect sensation. This is the reason, too, why all the convolutions and bendings of the cortex concentrate themselves in this, or tend hither by a continual flux and union. This is observed as well in outward as in inward intuitions. We even direct our contemplations toward this prow of the brain. Also, when this is injured, the faculty of clearly seeing and perceiving is changed according to the degree of injury, as appears from various diseases of the head. Thus sensation belongs indeed to every cortical glandule, but it is more perfect in one part of the brain than in another. For in one it is more particular and single, according to the divisions of the brain, while in another part it is more general, and hence the sensation is more indistinct and obscure, as in the lowest layers of the brain and in the cerebellum. 20. No cortical glandule in the whole brain is absolutely like another. Hence neither are the little sensories similar to each other, which are so many cortical glandules. But a certain variety intervenes, which nevertheless is so harmonious that not the least difference occurs in the mode of any sensation, but what is perceived more perfectly in one glandule than in another. That there occur infinite mutations of state, both essential and accidental, of the cortical glandules, which are so many internal sensories, has been sufficiently demonstrated in the treatise concerning those glandules. For there are larger and smaller glandules, harder and softer, consisting of more or less fibres. There are those whose state is more constricted or more expanded. Some associate with more, some with less, but to enumerate every difference would be too prolix. The cortical glandules in the brain are of one kind, those of the cerebellum are of another, and those of still another in the medulla oblongata and the medulla spinalis. Also they are of different species of the brain itself, in its vertex, in its borders, on the outside near to the pia mater, and on the inside around the ventricles. All the cortical glandules, the beginning of the fibres, the little sensories and motors, are internal. Now, in order that the brain may be free to receive all sensations and feel every difference, it is necessary that there should be order among its sensories. This order must be wholly harmonious. Even if one glandule receives a purer, another a grosser mode, nevertheless we must communicate the sign of its sensation to the others as a part to the whole. This is called the harmonious variety, which is so proper to nature that it deserves to be called the nature of nature. Such a variety exists in the particular fibres, in the particular muscles, in the single parts of the atmosphere. For similarly are the lowest atmospheres more compressed than the higher, in such a way, nevertheless, that between all there is a certain harmonious variety. Thus the particulars contribute each in its own part to the common and public estate. 21. The sensations diffused throughout the whole brain are to be conceived of as winding themselves around in a spiral manner, or according to the form of motion of a circuit and of the cortical substances, and the purer sensations revolve vortically through the cortical glandule, hence according to the most substantial form itself of the sensory organ. The convolutions of the cortical glandules in the brain flow into the form of the most perfect spiral, and because the sensations touch every point, every fibre, and every cortex of the brain, hence we must conceive of a similar circumvolution and whirling motion of the sensations, for then an easy fluxion and propagation of these proceeds from a part into the whole. In the same manner the modification takes place in each individual cortical gland, whose form is perpetually spiral or vortical. For every active force impressed upon an organic substance flows and is determined most exactly according to the form of the latter. To flow otherwise would be contrary to the stream and current of its nature, or contrary to the rotation of its axis. Also the sensation circumgyrates by a similar form when it follows along its fibres, therefore also when it emerges from it. So are the forms of effluxion and that of its atmosphere or of its modification similar. So do the macrocosm and the microcosm mutually correspond, and impress the same modes upon each other. Such a whirling motion openly appears in the external organs also, when the mind is inebriated, or the brain affected by a like disease or delirium. From these statements it may appear with what winding about and circumgyrations the inmost sensation or the understanding is carried on, the form of whose fluxion is celestial, and so on. 22. We may perceive by ourselves and naturally the harmony and the disharmony of sensations. That the soul naturally apprehends and is conscious of everything harmonious or inharmonious which occurs to any sense appears from the phenomena of each sense. Harmony of touch in the outmost skin tickles and excites laughter. Harmony of taste and smell flatters and gratifies the organs in such wise that it creates a pleasure, sweetness, and appetite. Harmony of hearing so pleases the ear that one smiles at what is heard said. So with harmony of sight, whence is beauty, comeliness, and delights. But disharmonies produce the contrary effect, for these sadden the soul and the mind, and induce a certain horror, even hurt, and thence aversions. Even in the imagination and the thought a similar concord of truths, which are so many harmonies, is likewise produced by nature herself, without science to direct, and without art as a mistress. Thence it comes that those whose minds are more healthy, and who are imbued with some knowledge, apprehend natural truths at once, and lend them their approval. But that the same truths are opposed is the result of a vicious state of their mind. That the soul perceives the harmony or disharmony of images and ideas at the first glance appears plainly enough in the brute animals, for birds know of themselves how to ingeniously construct their nests, to choose the food most proper to themselves, and to avoid what is harmful. The spider weaves its web with the most perfect geometry, not to speak of other instances which are effects of the natural perception of harmonies. Even the organs themselves are not only soothed by harmonies and pleasant things, but are also restored by them, while on the contrary they are injured by those which are inharmonious. The reason is that the soul is pure intelligence, and is the order and truth of its own microcosm. Hence the cognition of order and of truth is a faculty born with us, and one that is rarely learned. Neither can the senses otherwise exist, for in order that there be a sense, there must be the harmonious mixed with the inharmonious. From the difference of these and their connections and their situation arises sensation. In the same way, from commingled truths, fallacies, and falsehoods arise ratiocination, thoughts, discourse, controversy, opinions. Without these there would be very little speech and neither schools nor sciences, and the shelves of the libraries would remain empty. 23. In the same inmost sensory organ the end of the sensations and the beginning of the actions meet. The cortical glandule is the last boundary where sensations terminate, and the first prison house whence the actions break forth, for the fibres, both sensory and motory, begin and end in these glandules. Sensations penetrate from the outmost to the inmost, but actions run from the inmost to the outmost. Thus the cortical gland is as well a little internal sensory as a motory organ, and both active and passive. as are all the more perfect organic substances. To suffer as well as to act is the perfection of natural bodies, whence comes elasticity in the forces and powers thence resulting. The superior forms receive every assailing force and return a similar. If a comparison be instituted with the sensories here described, sensation itself is the passion to which a similar action corresponds. The object of the action may be to determine what is felt into act, or to represent through the act the idea perceived, for action is the actual representation of the idea of the mind. This is the reason why the perceived idea so quickly breaks forth into act, as in speech. It would be otherwise if both action and passion did not meet in one and the same organ. End of section 7.